I'd always been interested in intersections between art and science, and um, really, I grew up with computers. My father was a mathematician and a computer scientist, so I was literally crawling around on the floor and picking up floppy disks and stuff. Those are the big ones, the 5.5 quarter inch or whatever. And so I got involved with kind of writing small computer programs, when I was like in grade school. And that kind of started me thinking about connections particularly between mathematics and art. And so I was really interested in different types of geometry and the kinds of images that different types of algorithms could create. And certainly, if I go back, one of the things that really fascinated me was Dadaism and the Fluxus movement, and even like the happenings of the 60s and 70s. So those were, and particularly Fluxus, Joseph Beuys, those types of performative, action-oriented works were really influential to me when I was in graduate school. I had been really interested for a process of a kind of an interaction that is almost unconscious or intuitive. And so working with other improvisers, whether it was using the eye tracking instrument that I developed or in other ways, was really important to me as kind of an investigation. And I think that came out of working with human-computer interaction and reading about it a lot, trying to program systems for people to interact with computers. And I was thinking about that kind of interaction, which of course, when you're programming interaction with a computer, it's very methodical, and a lot of times you have a very one-to-one relationship with action-reaction with a computer. And that, to me, I thought that was really very different than the way humans interact with each other, that I think has a lot of different layers and a lot of different levels. So I was interested in that. Another thing that I was really interested in at the time was remote communication. I still am. Here we are talking on the phone, right? And so we're missing this, eye contact and stuff. We might have that in iChat, but there's also a lot of things that are missing in iChat or even the highest end video conferencing system. So that was another thing I was interested in, working on programming, or at least investigating what happens when two people are together in a room and they're making art together, improvising music or whatever. That process that can be really cathartic. I was really interested in investigating what is that about, and is there a way to try and reproduce that with a computer, or is it just something or is it something that's inherent to being human? So that was just something that was interesting in investigation for me. I can't really say that when I started doing this work that I was thinking about reaching a greater audience necessarily. I think I was thinking more about what the work was expressing and the ways that the work could express things. And and I was definitely frustrated with this, as you say, the white box. And even today, I was thinking about these questions, and I was thinking, even today, it's like 10% of gallery spaces are really gonna have adequate equipment and setup and infrastructure for technology-based work. I mean, they just don't have it. And maybe that is something about the nature of technology-based work, that it just doesn't fit into that kind of structure so well. And I mean, what I found for myself in terms of, and I think probably a lot of the other artists that are in the show have done, is that we've been the people who've gone into the gallery and also have been involved with writing the grants and curating the shows and kind of forcing the galleries to start thinking about these different types of works and putting those works in the gallery. So that, I think that's been an important part of the process, is to try and change the culture all the time. I mean, certainly even in like an academic setting, trying to change the culture there as well. I think that's something that we've all been involved in. But just in terms of audience, yeah, I mean, I would really have to say that a increased audience is, for me, maybe more of a bonus than an actual conscious effort. I think it was more, at least at first, in the case of how do you do this work, and particularly, like, for example, networked work. Obviously, like, some of my earliest work with the internet were pieces that involved participation from people in remote locations on the internet. So, and then trying to figure out ways that that participation could be somehow represented visually or otherwise in the gallery. And so for me, it was more about taking all this information from the network, or getting the voices from the network, and kind of bringing those together. I mean, one of, maybe just an example, I did a piece, maybe in the late 80s or early 90s, that was called White Wall, Black Hole, and it was in a gallery space, and it had a number of speakers mounted on the wall, and the speakers were would create sound when information from a wideband radio. I kind of had a ham radio in the gallery, and so whatever sort of police radio or cell phones that I could pick up, or different kinds of radio came through to the gallery, it would create this noise and create a physical reaction in the gallery. I had covered the wall with kind of this white powder, and so when the sound came out loud enough, it would knock the powder off the wall. And I remember when I did that piece, I was thinking about this kind of fantasy or conceit that I had, that someday we would be able to hear and have access to all the signals that are going through our bodies right now, at any moment. So, like, right now I'm sitting here and I'm getting all these radio waves and microwaves and black box transmissions from airplanes, or whatever, and they're all these waves that are coming through my body right this moment. And I kind of had this fantasy that what if someday in the future you could actually access every single one of those, including stuff from outer space or whatever. It's kind of weird. It's funny, it just seems like every time you're trying to do a project, you're kind of having to build the tools at the same time you're doing the work, and they kind of start to blend together. But for a long time, the tools and things that I was building were things that I was just using myself and not necessarily sharing. And I think in the last 5 or 6 years, I've started to build into my process a way of creating open source tools. So I hope to do that a lot more. I've only done that really a small amount right now. But I think that, and I see that also in the process of other artists, and I think that's an incredibly important part of this work, is as you're developing the tools to kind of put them out there as open source and let them live in a certain sense. And I think in a lot of ways this goes back to your question about activism, because I think that also is a kind of an activism, to allow your software and your tools to become part of the common body of knowledge, and really working against some of these copyright laws that have become so repressive, and using, every time I do something now, I do some sort of Creative Commons license, for example. I'm sure some of the other artists have been talking about that. And so it's a certain way of saying this this work is meant to live and be influential or not, and but to live out there and allow other people to have access to it. And it's not just about having access to a particular performance or a particular experience, but also having access to the tools that created that performance or experience. Well, I've just been so fortunate and so happy to be able to have these experiences working with scientists, because I think it's really bringing together a lot of the things that I've always wanted to do with my work, and it's really been inspiring, and especially in terms of, for example, visualization, where science now, at least the scientists that I've been working with, who have been meteorological, atmospheric, and climate scientists, have told me that visualization is a part of their process that is completely it cannot be separated from their scientific process. Without the visualizations, they wouldn't be able to do the analysis that they need to. So that's another point. The visualization of information is another point where artists and scientists really meet. And in my case, I was working with sonification of information, so turning the information into sound rather than imagery. And that's been something that several scientists that I've worked with have been interested in exploring and saying, is there something that I can learn from listening to my data, that I may not learn from seeing my data, for example. But just going back to tools, yeah, for example, I mean, we made, I worked with a computer science student and programmed a custom object for Max MSP called Data Reader, and we made that open source. And actually, a couple weeks after we made it open source, somebody made a PC version of it. We had just a Mac version of it, and somebody out in the ether came back and said, "Oh, here's a PC version that I made." I think I'm still at that point of fascination of that kind of idea, where I just want to take some information that on the surface seems to be really straightforward, and try and find what's the surprising or the complexity within it. And certainly, for example, on the Atmospherics WeatherWorks storm sonification project, my collaborator Glenn listened to the sound for the first time, and he felt that he was hearing what he called gravity waves, which were kind of these echoes of movement of pressure in the storm over long distances. And he knew that they existed, but he had never seen them on a visualization. But on a sonification, he was able to hear them happening, and so that was pretty exciting to him. It's something I had no idea what a gravity wave was or what that was about. So that was pretty great. And also in terms of kind of audience, non-scientist reaction, has been, the really emotional reaction that people have had. And I think this is directly related to the way people perceive and receive sound, information through their ears versus information through their eyes. I think sound is very intimate and very personal. And when you start to make these complex data sets, or these data sets that represent the earth or the environment, and you start to turn those into sound, people start to make a very personal and emotional connection to that information. I don't want to say that people don't make personal or emotional connections to images, and certainly if you think about the big blue marble image, or the first image of the earth from space, people's response to that was incredibly emotional. But I do think that there is a certain emotional level that people get from sound, and there's also a presence that people receive from sound, a feeling of actually being there when you hear the sounds. I sort of think about, just on the emotional level, I think about when the cell phone calls on 9/11 were released. And I can't even listen to those. if they're on television or something, I have to, turn off the sound, because they're just so incredibly emotional to me. But I wanted to go back to something that we talked about before, which is about artists and scientists, process and tools. And I think that something that's happening now is that a lot of the tools and the developments of technology is making it possible for artists and scientists to go out into the field more. And so rather than, our tools for a long time, our tools forced us into the studio or into the lab because the tools were, for example, computers were so huge, for a long time, and kind of stationary objects that need to be in one place, or our cameras, needed to be in the studio, and certain types of, lighting and all those types of things. And then if you talk about in the sciences, the kinds of tools that scientists were using, their computers, again, very large stationary objects. And I think what's happening now is this miniaturization of technology, and it's giving both artists and science the opportunity to go out into the field, and that's really changing the process. And I think it's also opening up the field for more artists and scientists collaborations, because people can go out together, for example, and measure air quality. This is something I know that you have done a lot in terms of chemical makeup of the air, and you can do that with tiny devices, or you can go out and measure noise levels, and you can send that information to a database. You can have a number of people out in the field, and I think that's a really rich space, and I think it's a space where artists and scientists are starting to work together, kind of going back to Joseph Beuys or Fluxus, or even the Debord and psychogeographers. That experience of being out in the space is providing a certain type of experience and a certain type of information that you can't get locked in a studio or locked in a lab. I actually think it's really problematic right now in a lot of ways. I mean, if we go back to, if we think about Isaiah, and I just participated in this event in Brooklyn called Conflux. A lot of the work was mobile media and located media, which I think is incredibly fascinating and just wonderful work, and is sort of the future, location-aware media that's involved, that's using GPS and other types of location-aware devices, work that's out in the world. But it's really, really problematic because it's almost invisible. I mean, this is what happened at Conflux, and I think happened to a lot of pieces in Isaiah. You would, get a card about a piece, or you'd hear information about a piece, but it's kind of like Gertrude Stein, there's no there. It's like, where are they? Where's the work? Oh, it's driving around in a ice cream truck, or it's people walking around with their cell phones. And so there's no, it's difficult to find a real presence of the work. And if you see, for example, it's sending data to a database, and you're viewing it on a screen. For example, Beatrice DaCosta's wonderful pigeon blog work, that you could access the data from the pigeons on a website, or you could view it on a projection in the gallery. That's still not the work. And so I think that, as exciting as that work is, I think it's a real problem and a real challenge for venues to figure out how should this be presented to people, how should people experience it. Do you only experience it as a participant with your mobile device, or can you be a non-participating audience member and almost like view it from an aerial perspective or something? I mean, how is this work going to reach its audience? And I think it's a real challenge right now, but really exciting. I'm really looking for the day when we can have constant, free, open transmission from everywhere. When are we gonna? My fantasy, of course, is that every place in the U.S. or the world, for that matter, is Wi-Fi, is free Wi-Fi enabled. I don't know if it's going to happen, and I think that's something, because of the market forces, and I think that's something that we, artists as a group, and joining with other groups as well, need to continue to advocate for, because it is just so important in the development of knowledge. As you look at it, at this bridge, there's like 20 smokestacks all around the bridge, and you see those, and when they're pumping out the smoke, they're the ugliest thing that you can imagine. To me, I think the turbines are beautiful.
To incorporate function and aesthetics, and trying to create things that are not only efficient, but they're beautiful.
I work in Manhattan and live in Queens, so it occurred to me as I was looking out the window at the bridge that this bridge really represents, for me, I think what it's represented for people since it was originally created, a kind of a lifeline to Manhattan. See the outline of the shape of the bridge through these beautiful white lights. And one day in 2003, as the sun was going down, I noticed that the lights weren't coming on, but it kept happening day after day. Once I did a little research that the mayor had decided that the $75,000 cost to light the necklace lights on the bridges was too much for the city to afford. So then I was thinking about, well, what about this relationship between our power and the aesthetics of the city, the beauty of the city. The first thing to go, of course, is the aesthetics. The first thing to get cut in any kind of economic crisis. Yet, at the same time, I think that's an extremely important part of people's quality of life and people's experience of the city. Why not use renewable energy to replace some of that beauty, and maybe even expand on some of that beauty without using up natural resources? So the idea was to think about how one might work with the architecture of the city, with this incredible historical architecture of the Queensboro Bridge, and maybe even bring back some of the original look of the bridge, while at the same time providing some renewable energy to the city.
In urban areas, climate change effects will be integrated across all the different sectors. The energy sector is going to be very affected by global warming. What we need to do is reduce our emissions of carbon dioxide and the greenhouse gases. The carbon dioxide mainly comes from the burning of fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal. Another way that we can work on mitigating the greenhouse gas emissions is to develop alternative energies.
When we approached this project, one of the first things we took into consideration is what is the visual impact going to be on the bridge with the turbines. So we started with the most efficient turbines that are available, that are quite large. They will be seen from miles away. The advantages, of course, is that they will produce more power. Not only could you power the lights on the bridge, but you most likely could provide power to the walkways on Roosevelt Island. You could provide power to the walkways on the Manhattan and the Queensboro sides, depending on the capacitor and the engineering capabilities and how they are able to interface with power distribution. And in the second design, what we had done is taken the same turbine but a smaller version of it. This one's about 65 feet high, and the turbine is about 17 feet across. One thing that this is similar to is that at one point in time there were spires on the top of the bridge. So putting the big pole on there is going to replace something that was lost, and then we're just adding the turbine to the top of that. Third and finally, on this one we have taken the sculpture that's at the top of the bridge and we repeated that same shape and design And this style of research is something that's very exciting because it is trying to create turbines that will mirror or reflect something comparable to the architecture that's involved.
If we keep on putting CO2 into the atmosphere, the warming will continue indefinitely. The problem is so enormous that we have to do everything. We can't say we're only going to do one or only we're going to do another. We basically have to do everything. And I think a big part of it is actually that we have to start ourselves.
Certainly, I think a lot of people think that technology, the march of technology is kind of this inevitable manifest destiny, and that every piece of technology that's being developed and the way it's being developed is inevitable and is only because that's what science can do.
I believe that we have to work really at the cultural level. Because New York is the cultural leader of the whole world, if we do it here, we're going to have a tremendous impact, I believe, on our other cities, like other big cities, London, Tokyo, Shanghai.
The things that are being developed are the things that are being funded, things that are being supported, and there are other directions that our society could be moving. And so the idea is to really say, look, if we're serious about dealing with this problem of our energy resources disappearing, and if we're serious about solving global warming, and we look at this as an actual potential problem, you know, as an artist, I feel like it's my responsibility, one, and also I feel like I want to tell this to the community somehow, or have some sort of impact on what the community does. Why can't New York be a green city with full of renewable energy in the next 20, 50 years?